In the quiet town of Brenham, Texas, a young boy named Ricky was out in the open field, practicing baseball in his own way. He didn't have a bat or a proper ball, just a stick and a few scattered stones. That didn't bother him. What did make things harder were the leg braces strapped around both of his legs. Still, Ricky stood tall and focused. He swung the stick with determination, training as if he were playing in the big leagues. From a distance, his father stood watching silently. Ricky didn't notice him at first, but after hitting one of the stones with a clean swing, Ricky turned around to see if his dad had caught it, if he'd seen that perfect shot. For a second, he hoped there might be a nod of approval. Instead, his dad simply turned and walked back inside the house without saying a word. Not long after, one of Ricky's friends, Gracie, came walking over. She had that look of playful skepticism on her face. "You're cheating," she told him, squinting at the distance the stone had traveled. Ricky raised an eyebrow. "I'm not," he said quickly. "I think I'm just lucky. Maybe lucky enough to play in the majors one day." Gracie laughed. "You're crazy." Ricky smiled and swung again. The stone soared across the field, landing even farther than before. Later that Sunday, the scene shifted to a small local church where James, the town pastor, was delivering a passionate sermon. The congregation sat quietly, most of them listening. But in the middle row, Gracie's father, Earl, leaned back in the pew and casually lit a cigarette, letting the smoke drift upward. On the other side of the room, Mrs. Babbitt repeatedly spit chewing tobacco onto the church floor, as if it were no big deal. James tried to continue with his message, but couldn't ignore it any longer. In a calm, humble tone, he asked Earl and Mrs. Babbitt to stop. "This is the house of God," he said. "We need to keep it clean." Earl scoffed and grew defensive, but James stood his ground. He wasn't there to argue, just to remind them of where they were. "God's house must stay pure," he said firmly. Meanwhile, outside the church, the kids were making their way toward an open field. Ricky led the way, walking carefully over uneven ground. At one point, he stopped, noticing a cool-looking stick lying off to the side. He picked it up and examined it, lightweight but strong. "Just right." He handed a stone to Robert, another one of the kids, and asked him to throw it. Connie, standing nearby, slipped into the role of commentator. Now stepping up to the plate, it's Ricky, the next big league hitter. Ricky smiled and closed his eyes for a second, imagining the stadium, the crowd, the spotlight. Then he watched the stone fly toward him and swung hard. The hit was perfect. The stone shot through the air, flying far across the field until crack. The sound of breaking glass echoed back. Everyone froze. Connie dropped the act. Robert's eyes widened. Without saying a word, the kids turned and started running. Except Ricky. He stopped. He remembered what his father had always told him. Take responsibility for what you do. So instead of running, Ricky turned around and walked toward where the stone had landed. They soon reached the spot and found a man standing next to a car with a cracked windshield. His name was Ray. He looked over the group and spotted Ricky walking toward him, calm and honest. "I'll get a job," Ricky said quietly, "and I'll pay for the damage." Ray didn't seem angry. In fact, he was more surprised than anything. He looked down at Ricky's leg braces, then at the distance the stone had flown. "You hit that with just a stick?" he asked. Ricky nodded. Ray let out a low whistle. "You're a prodigy. I pray your leg heals, son. You got a gift." He paused and smiled. "Go ahead. Hit another one for me." Ricky took the challenge. Robert threw him another stone, and Ricky swung again. Just like before, the stone soared through the air and crack. It hit the windshield again. Ray just stared in disbelief. That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, the mood shifted when Helen, Ricky's mother, began speaking her mind. Her voice was calm, but her words carried weight. She talked about how James, for all his spiritual commitment, seemed blind to the way his actions were affecting their lives. "He's so hell-bent on biting the hands that barely feed him and his family," she said. The room went still. Then she brought up something that made everyone uncomfortable. She pointed out that Ricky's so-called devotion, his long hours of training, his faith, his belief in God's plan, had left him malnourished. "The boy's not eating right," she said softly. No one replied. Not a sound. The table fell completely silent. Later that night, things felt lighter again. Ricky and Robert were sitting together, flipping through a small stack of baseball cards. The cards were spread out across the table during what was supposed to be their evening Bible reading. James walked in and spotted them. "What's this?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Robert stammered for a second, then explained, "I got them for Ricky. He loves baseball." James didn't scold them. Instead, he looked at Ricky and said, "I know you're always practicing, even when you're hurting." "I see it." Ricky nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. James gave them both a look that was somewhere between serious and kind, then left the room. After he was gone, Ricky sat in silence, staring down at one of the cards. He held it carefully, almost like it was something sacred. Then, softly, he whispered a verse from Isaiah under his breath, drawing strength from the words as he held the image of his favorite player in his hand. On Sunday morning, the family packed into the car and drove to church. But when they arrived, something was off. The entire congregation was standing outside, waiting, every person facing their vehicle like a silent wall. James stopped the car, but didn't get out. Earl stepped forward and spoke before James could say anything. "The flock doesn't want you anymore," he said. "You have to leave." James took a breath, then nodded. "We'll be gone by morning," he said calmly. "We don't stay where we're not welcome." Just then, Helen had had enough. She opened the car door and stepped out, her face set in quiet anger. The next morning, true to his word, James packed up the family's belongings, loaded the car, and they hit the road, leaving Brenham behind. As they were driving out, James spotted something up ahead. Earl was trying to get into his truck, clearly drunk. The man fumbled with the door handle, barely able to stand straight. James pulled over. Out of simple compassion, James approached and tried to stop him from getting behind the wheel. "You'll kill yourself," he warned gently. But Earl didn't care. He brushed off the concern, muttering something under his breath. That's when Ricky shouted at him, tired of watching people like Earl throw kindness away. Earl, angry and irrational, lunged toward Ricky, trying to raise a hand. James stepped in and wrestled him back, eventually managing to guide him into his house. Inside, James noticed something. Earl's wife stood quietly in the corner, a fresh bruise on her face. He didn't say anything. He just saw it and understood. Back on the road, the family kept moving until suddenly, the car started to sputter. James slowed down and pulled over. The engine cut out completely. He stepped out and looked around. They were in the middle of nowhere. Not a house, not a gas station in sight. Without saying anything, James walked behind the trunk, knelt down on the shoulder of the road, and closed his eyes. He didn't speak at first, just lowered his head, visibly exhausted. Then finally, his voice cracked through the silence. He asked God for a sign. Something. Anything. And then, for the first time in years, he let his frustration slip. He stood up and kicked the car, once hard, gritting his teeth. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Ricky rushed to his side. "You okay?" he asked, grabbing his dad's arm. Helen walked over too, putting a hand on James's back. "It's all right," she said gently. "We'll figure something out." James shook his head. "I sold the spare tire for a gallon of gas," he admitted. The silence that followed didn't last long. Grandma, calm and firm as always, looked him in the eye and said, "You did the right thing." James looked around and let out a breath. "We're probably the unluckiest family in Texas," he muttered. And then something happened. They started laughing. One by one, every person in that family broke into laughter. It wasn't because things were good. It was because they were together, even in the middle of the mess. The laughter echoed down the empty road as they huddled together to keep dry from the falling rain. Hours later, a sleek car slowed down and pulled over beside them. Inside was an elderly woman, well-dressed, sitting behind the wheel. She rolled down the window and called out, "Y'all need a ride?" James stepped forward and nodded. "We could use the help." She smiled, motioned for them to get in, and drove them to her large, elegant home, a mansion compared to anything they'd ever known. Not long after arriving at the mansion, the kids found themselves sitting in front of something they had never seen before, a colored television. The screen flickered to life, casting vibrant images across their wide-eyed faces. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared in stunned silence. For Ricky and the others, it was like watching magic happen right there in the living room. In the same house, just a few feet away, the family was seated with the elderly woman's husband. He was kind, soft-spoken, and clearly a man of faith. Over warm conversation, he welcomed them and shared stories of the town and the people he knew. As they spoke, he mentioned something that made James sit up a little straighter. He said his brother Dennis, who lived out in Bowie City, had been searching for a pastor for quite some time. The position had remained open, mostly because folks thought the area was too small or too remote. No one wanted the job. But to this man, it seemed like just the kind of place James might be called to. The next morning, the family packed up again and headed toward Bowie City. When they arrived, their new host, Dennis, led them to the house that would be theirs. The car came to a slow stop in front of a building that looked more like an abandoned shack than a home. Paint peeled off the siding, the porch was tilted, and the yard was wild with overgrown weeds. No one said a word. No one even opened the car door. Except James. He stepped out slowly, taking it all in without speaking. Dennis, trying to shift the mood, smiled and suggested they visit the church instead. "You'll love it," he said. James didn't say no. He figured it couldn't hurt to look. When they arrived at the church, it wasn't much better. The exterior was worn, the paint faded and flaking. The front steps creaked under their weight, and there were several cigarette butts scattered across the entryway. Dennis looked around and nodded approvingly. "I think it's a fine place," he said. James paused, hands on his hips, then replied with a careful smile. "It's got possibilities." Later that day, Ricky and Robert wandered through the new town, getting a feel for the place. As they turned down a side street, they saw a group of kids playing baseball in an open field. The familiar sound of laughter and the crack of a bat instantly pulled Ricky in. He walked up with Robert beside him. "You got room for two more?" Ricky asked. One of the players, Jason, the catcher, looked him up and down. "Not with all those contraptions on your leg," he said bluntly. Another boy, older and clearly the loudmouth of the group, stepped forward. "Yeah," Quinn sneered. "You'd probably fall over trying to swing." Robert crossed his arms. "If Ricky doesn't play, I don't either." The kids hesitated, then agreed to let Ricky take a few swings. He stepped up to the plate. On the first pitch, he swung late and barely made contact. On the second pitch, he twisted awkwardly and fell flat onto the dirt. Robert ran over to help him up. "Let's just go," he said quietly. But Ricky shook his head. No, he stood on his own, pulled the bat closer to his side, and stared at the braces wrapped around his legs. Then, without hesitation, he took the bat and struck the side of one brace hard. The sound echoed through the field. He hit it again, adjusting the fit so he could twist better. It hurt, but he didn't show it. On the third pitch, he swung with all his strength. The ball flew high and deep, sailing past the outfielders and landing far into the grass. The kids stared in disbelief. Quinn scowled, trying to save face. "Still not playing with a robot boy," he muttered. Robert turned to him, frustrated. "You're just mad 'cause he hit your pass." Quinn pushed him hard. Robert held his ground, but didn't swing back. Jason stepped in, his voice serious now. "If you fight again, Coach is kicking you off the team. You know that." Quinn backed off without a word. Ricky stood quietly, brushing dirt off his pants. The field had gone silent, but the message was clear. He belonged. Some time had passed since the family first arrived in Bowie City. Life was still simple, but there was a little more warmth in the air. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, James joined them like he always did, but something felt different. He paused halfway to his seat. Everyone was smiling at him. He looked around a little confused. "What's got y'all grinning like that?" he asked. No one answered at first, until Ricky stood up. Slowly, and with quiet pride, Ricky stepped forward. This time, his legs were bare. The braces were gone. James blinked. "Ricky," he whispered. For a long second, he didn't say anything else. He just smiled back, deeply, fully, watching his son stand tall without support. The next day, Ricky and Robert headed out with the neighborhood boys to the community baseball field. The coach, a sturdy man with a firm tone but kind eyes, gathered them all together. "I run this team like a family," he said. "That means showing up. That means giving your all. I expect commitment and discipline. You want to wear the jersey, You gotta earn it. He handed out forms to every boy, permission slips to be signed by their parents. When his eyes landed on Ricky, he paused for a second. Then he nodded. I can tell you've worked hard to be here, he said. I respect that. That night, Ricky quietly approached James with the consent form in his hands. He seemed nervous, a little uncertain. James noticed right away. He took the form, but didn't sign it. Instead, he set it down and looked at Ricky. Recite Psalm 23, he said gently. Ricky hesitated, then began. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. James listened, then spoke softly. I believe the Lord kept you here for something greater than baseball. Maybe there's a reason for what you've gone through. But Ricky didn't say anything. He just turned around and ran out of the room, leaving James sitting there, troubled and silent. Sunday morning arrived, and James stood at the pulpit, delivering his sermon as usual. But midway through, he spotted something that pulled his focus, a man in the back row, casually smoking a cigarette. James paused. The old urge to correct him was there. It sat on his tongue, but he didn't say anything. The thought lingered, distracting him more than he wanted to admit, but he chose to stay silent. After the service ended, as the crowd filtered out, Helen handed Ricky a small envelope. It's from Gracie, she said with a smile. Ricky took it quickly and tucked it away before anyone could see. Later that day, Ricky, Robert, and Connie gathered whatever coins they could find. They had one mission in mind, buying a burger for their dad. After counting everything, they realized they were short by just 25 cents. At the counter, a kind waitress noticed them fumbling through their pockets. You missing a quarter? She asked. Robert nodded, a little embarrassed. She smiled and pulled one from her apron. Here, she said. Call it a gift. Back at home, James was sitting in his chair when the kids came in, all gathered around a paper bag. He looked up. What's all this? Connie handed him the burger. We know you take care of all of us, she said. All year. Ricky chimed in. So today we wanted to take care of you. James looked at the three of them, then down at the warm burger in his hands. His eye stayed on it for a moment. Then he smiled. That night, Ricky lay in bed with the lights off, a blanket pulled over his head. Tucked beneath the covers, he opened the letter he had been hiding all day. It was from Gracie. She wrote to say that she and her family would be moving away. There wasn't much detail, just a few simple lines, but enough to make Ricky stare at the paper longer than he meant to. He folded the letter back up quietly and placed it beside his pillow. The next morning, Ricky and Robert stood outside the baseball field. The rest of the boys were already playing, running drills, and tossing balls. Ricky and Robert watched from behind the fence. They didn't have permission to join, not officially. Jason, one of the players, walked up and told them that the coach wasn't checking signatures that closely. If they really wanted to play, he said they could just sign the form themselves. He claimed the real wrong would be not letting Ricky play at all. Robert hesitated, but then made a decision. He believed Ricky deserved to be on that field. So he took the form and signed James's name on it, hoping that, in God's eyes, the intent would matter more than the ink. Later, when James spoke with the coach, he told him he hadn't signed anything. But the coach just smiled. He said that sometimes boys got creative when they wanted something badly. Then he added that in all his years, he hadn't seen a kid play like Ricky could. That kind of talent, he said, was rare. After the coach left, Ricky tried to step up and take responsibility for the forged signature. But before he could say too much, Robert admitted he was the one who had signed it. He stood there, waiting for the consequences. Inside the house, Helen's mother stepped in before James could say much. She reminded him sharply that he'd turned his own family into sheep, obedient but joyless. She said that his way of guiding them had drained the spirit out of the people he loved. Ricky, who had been listening, responded not with argument, but with something James had once said from the pulpit. A man's gifts, he repeated, weren't meant to be hidden. They were meant to serve God. Robert, already bracing for punishment, began to cry. James told him to step outside. In the backyard, James followed him, holding the belt in his hand. But as he raised it, his arms froze. He looked at Robert, small, trembling, yet honest, and found he couldn't go through with it. After a pause, he told Robert to go back inside. James stood in the quiet yard alone, and tears filled his eyes. Some time passed. One afternoon, Ricky came to find his father in the church. The building was empty, quiet. James sat near the front, reflecting. Ricky walked down the aisle and told him something he had been thinking about for a while. He believed that God had given him two gifts. One was for preaching, the other for playing baseball. He said he planned to use both. His voice to spread the gospel, and his hands to play with power. Years passed. Ricky had grown into the pride of the Buffaloes, a senior sensation with a powerful swing and a confident stride. The braces were long gone. On the field, he moved with strength, his body trained and seasoned by years of determination. In the opening game of the 1973 season, Ricky sealed the win with a soaring home run that brought the crowd to its feet. Among those clapping in the stands was a familiar face, Ray, the same man whose windshield Ricky had cracked with a stone all those years ago. He was there to support Ricky's journey, proud to have witnessed where it began. After the game, the group celebrated near the dugout. That's when a voice from the past called out to them. It was Gracie. She hadn't changed much, still warm, still sharp. As she approached, Connie quickly grabbed Robert and pulled him aside, claiming they needed to fix something. It was an obvious excuse, but it gave Ricky and Gracie a moment alone. The conversation between them was natural, filled with small laughs and quiet looks. Gracie mentioned someone named Ned, a sports writer she thought Ricky should meet. There was a polite introduction, but the chemistry between her and Ricky said more than words. Before long, Helen invited them all to dinner, and the group sat down to catch up over food. Later that evening, James walked in and greeted Gracie kindly. When the topic of church came up, James invited her to Sunday service. Ned, standing nearby, questioned whether they skipped baseball games on Sundays. James, without hesitation, said he had once failed to guide his son toward a higher calling. There was a pause. Ned smiled awkwardly and admitted he'd seen Ricky play and was amazed. But James simply replied that he'd never seen his son play, not once. The next morning, Ricky and Gracie went for a quiet walk. They talked about the past, letters exchanged, memories kept. Ricky said he had saved every note she ever sent. She teased him for being sentimental, but admitted she'd kept two of his as well. When he asked why she stopped writing, she didn't answer right away. The question lingered in the air. As they walked, Ricky grimaced, pain tightening his face. Gracie noticed. She asked what was wrong, and he confessed that his back ached constantly. Years of hard play had taken a toll, but he kept the pain hidden. Doctors might bench him if they knew. He didn't want to stop. Later in the week, Ray sat down with Robert and Ricky. With a proud smile, he mentioned he was finally about to graduate high school. It was scouting season, the time when talent got noticed. He told them he was planning to call one of the best scouts he knew, someone with a sharp eye for the majors. He wanted the scout to come watch Ricky's game the next day. It might just be Ricky's chance to go pro. The stands were packed. This was the game Ray had prepared Ricky for, the one where a real scout would be watching from the crowd. The buzz around the field was high, but not everyone was rooting for Ricky. Quinn, still holding on to old grudges from years ago, was now on the opposing team. He made it clear before the game even started. His only goal was to take Ricky down, but Ricky didn't flinch. As the game kicked off, he stepped up to bat and made contact with the very first pitch, sending it flying and earning an early point for his team. The crowd roared. The scout watched closely, his attention locked on Ricky's every move. It looked like everything might go their way. In the second game, Ricky ran across the field to make a catch. But just as he reached for the ball, his foot hit something buried under the grass, a sprinkler head. His ankle twisted badly, and he collapsed to the ground in visible pain. The crowd went silent. The scout, watching from the stands, shifted in his seat, then quietly stood and left with the others. Just like that, Ricky's moment was over. At the hospital, the news wasn't good. The doctor told James and Helen that the damage to Ricky's ankle was serious. Walking again would take a miracle. Multiple surgeries were necessary just to stabilize the joint, and the cost would be steep, around $7,000. Even then, there were no guarantees. Back at home, James sat beside his son, struggling to find the right words. He said his heart broke for him. But Ricky, still raw with emotion, cut him off, and asked if this too was supposed to be part of God's plan. Another lesson wrapped in pain, another step toward becoming a pitiful cripple, as he called it. James tried to stop him from speaking that way. He told Ricky this might be the moment to let go of baseball and think about what else he wanted from life. But those words didn't help. Ricky, eyes stinging with tears, walked away. The first thing he heard from his father after losing everything was advice on how to move on. Later that evening, Ricky sat outside in the car, staring off in silence. Gracie joined him. She sat beside him and tried to lift his spirit, promising they'd figure out how to raise the money for his surgery. But Ricky didn't respond with hope. Instead, he gave short, sarcastic replies. His spirit seemed gone, and even her words couldn't bring him back. She stayed quiet for a while, then told him why she'd returned. Life had been rough, but when things got hard, thinking of him gave her something to hold on to. He looked at her, unsure what to say, and quietly asked if she'd let him be her first and last boyfriend. Gracie smiled. She didn't say yes, not yet. She only told him he'd have to try harder if that was supposed to be a proposal. Back at the church, James took the first step. He stood before his congregation, humbly explaining Ricky's injury and the cost of surgery. The response surprised him. People began reaching into their wallets, offering what they could. Their generosity filled the donation basket faster than expected. At the same time, Gracie was running her own fundraiser, quietly going door to door, explaining Ricky's story to anyone who would listen. She wasn't just raising money, she was building hope. A few days later, Ray stopped by the house. He'd heard about the surgery and came with big news. Two of the most respected scouts were coming to town for tryouts in 2 months. If Ricky could recover in time, this might be his only shot. Ray handed over a check to cover the final amount for surgery. James, who had always been cautious of Ray's influence, didn't hide his anger. He accused Ray of pushing Ricky too far, warning that he'd end up crippled. He told Ray to take his money and leave. But Lillian, tired of watching her son suffer and feeling James' pride had gone too far, took the check from Ray and thanked him. The rest of the family agreed. James said nothing more. He just turned and walked away. The surgery didn't bring the good news they hoped for. The damage was worse than expected. The doctors told Ricky that recovering in 7 weeks would be a miracle. There simply wasn't enough time before tryouts. One night, Ricky found his dad asleep in a chair, a medical journal open on his lap. James had been studying, trying to understand the specifics of his son's condition, quietly doing everything he could behind the scenes. After a movie night, Ricky walked Gracie home. As they sat outside, he finally admitted what had been weighing on him. He didn't think he could keep going. He feared that pushing too hard would leave him paralyzed, and that he'd ruin not just his dreams, but their future too. Gracie looked at him for a long moment. Then she told him that she missed the version of him who believed in big dreams. That's who gave her strength when she needed it most. But when Ricky stayed silent, unable to give her that hope back, she quietly walked away. Later that night, Robert ran to find Ricky. Something was wrong. When Ricky returned home, he found his grandmother lying in bed, her breathing shallow. The room was quiet. He sat by her side, tears already in his eyes, insisting the doctors were just being overly cautious. But Grandma wasn't afraid. She told him it was her time, and she was ready to meet the Lord. She shared one last story, how she had once given up her own dreams as a young woman to follow the man she loved. It was a hard choice, but she didn't regret it. Through that decision, she found the family she loved more than anything. Still, she admitted that the sting of what she left behind had never fully disappeared. She turned to James, eyes soft and fading. She told him he was a good man, but it was time to be more than that. She asked him to be a great man and to let Ricky go to the tryouts. James didn't speak, but he didn't have to. The look in his eyes said everything. He would honor her wishes. A few days later, they buried Grandma. The whole family gathered by the graveside, the air quiet and heavy. James stood beside the casket and spoke, his voice steady but soft. He talked about her strength, her honesty, how she always said the hard things, especially when people didn't want to hear them. She'd lived a full life, and now they had to live in a way that honored her. In the weeks that followed, Ricky slowly shed his cast. The pain was still there, but he pushed through it, determined not to let his chance slip away. Robert stayed by his side, throwing pitch after pitch, watching his brother find rhythm again. Each day brought more improvement, more confidence. One afternoon during practice, Ray showed up at the edge of the field with a look that meant business. He didn't waste any time, told Ricky that Red, the top scout in the region, was coming to watch. Ray believed in Ricky, and he didn't need a full game to prove anything. He just needed Red to see Ricky make contact once. That night, on the eve of the tryout, Ricky slipped quietly into the church. He sat alone, the pews empty, the light low. He wasn't there to ask for glory. He spoke humbly, saying he wasn't chasing fame or trying to prove his father wrong. In truth, he now understood James better, even appreciated how hard he tried to protect him. Ricky just wanted the strength to show up and do what he was born to do. He prayed for grace, not greatness. What Ricky didn't know was that James had been nearby, just out of sight listening. After Ricky left, James walked into the room, picked up his son's catcher's glove, and took a pen. In silence, he wrote a small message inside it, something only Ricky would find later when it mattered most. By morning, the tryout field was buzzing. Hundreds of hopefuls had gathered, each one dreaming of making it. Red stepped forward, introduced himself, and laid out how things would work. Coaches would run the boys through tests, cuts would be made, and by the end of the day, only the most promising would remain. The drills began. One by one, players were eliminated. The pace was quick, the judgment harsh. When Ricky's turn finally came, all eyes seemed to narrow on him. With the bat in hand, he stepped up focused. His swing was as clean and powerful as ever. The ball soared each time. No one could deny his talent at the plate. But the real issue showed when he had to run. Every few steps, Ricky paused, favoring his ankle. He tried to hide the limp, tried to shake it off, but the strain was visible. The coach watching from the side finally called him over. His tone wasn't unkind, but it was final. Ricky wasn't going to make it. Ricky, breathing hard, asked for one last shot. Just one more round of pitches. He promised he'd hit every single one. No errors, no hesitation. If he failed, he'd walk away without protest. And with that, he waited for the coach's decision. When the next round of batting began, Ricky shut everything else out. The pain in his leg, the noise from the crowd, the pressure, none of it mattered. He focused on the ball, and with every swing, he sent it flying deep into the air. One after another, they soared, over 400 feet across the field, crossing the boundary fence, and some even reaching into the adjacent stadium. Unbelievably, one of those balls landed near Red himself. Red looked up, confused at first, then surprised. He turned to his associate, baffled. There was no way a kid at a tryout was launching balls that far. Yet here they were, bouncing right at his feet. After the third one rolled in, Red stood up, clearly unsettled. He didn't recognize the hitter, but he told his associate to go find out who was hitting those bombs and to stop them before someone got hurt. Back at the tryout field, Ricky was still at it. He'd hit nearly 20 perfect shots by now. His arms were sore, his shirt soaked with sweat, but he didn't stop. What broke him wasn't his leg or the fatigue. It was when the final list was Red and his name wasn't on it. Red never showed up. No handshake, no nod, no scout waiting on the sidelines. Just silence. Ricky stared at the coaches in disbelief. Then, without a word, he let his bat fall to the dirt. He pulled off his glove, dropped it beside the plate, and walked off the field. The weight of everything, the surgeries, the sacrifice, the prayers, crashed down at once. He didn't care where he was going. He just drove. His car tore down familiar roads until he ended up in the same open patch of dirt where he used to train with stones and sticks as a kid. The same spot where he'd first started dreaming. Sitting alone, he let the memories flood in of Gracie, of Grandma, of the little boy in leg braces who refused to give up. Eventually, something inside him shifted. He got back in the car and returned to the field, not to hit again, but to pick up his glove. That's when he noticed something. Inside the leather, tucked in where his hand would rest, was his father's handwriting. It was a verse, one he hadn't seen before. From the book of Samuel, "Those who honor me, I will honor." Ricky held the glove for a moment, quietly taking it in. Then he looked toward the stadium where Red had gone. It wasn't over. Not yet. Not if he had anything to say about it. He walked up to the stadium entrance, limping slightly, but with determination in his stride. When he finally reached Red, he didn't stutter or second-guess himself. He told the scout that he was the best hitter he'd ever find, but he didn't make the cut because of an injury that would heal. Red, calm but cautious, explained the reality. He said a player with a bad leg was a risk, an expensive one, and that it would be better to wait until next year. But Ricky knew that might be too late. He didn't have the luxury of time. He told Red he had to do this now. And something about Ricky's conviction, the way he stood his ground despite everything, struck a chord. Red nodded slowly, then said he'd give him one shot. One real shot. He'd let Ricky bat in the final game, as a designated hitter for both teams. The level of competition would be high, pro level, to see how Ricky measured up. If he could handle that, maybe there really was a place for him in the big leagues after all. On the day of the final game, James sat at the table with his Bible open, flipping through notes as he tried to finalize his sermon for that evening. Helen was in the kitchen. She cracked eggs into a pan, cooked quietly, and placed a plate in front of him without a word. A few minutes later, she stepped outside to clear her head. James followed. He called her name softly and asked what was going on, why she was acting this way. She turned to him with tears already in her eyes. She said she wished her mother was there, because her mother would have understood. Then she brought up Ricky, how he was born with frail, twisted legs, and how the doctors had said he'd never walk. They said he'd never run, never be like other kids. But he did. He walked. He ran. He grew up into the kind of boy every parent dreams of. And now, here he was doing the unthinkable again. Helen looked James in the eye and asked how many miracles he needed before he could finally accept what was right in front of him. James stammered, unable to answer. She didn't wait for him to find the words. She turned and walked away. At the stadium, Ricky was already there. He was pacing near the dugout when he saw Gracie. She walked up with a smile and told him he'd gotten so good at hiding, she could hardly catch him anymore. Ricky just smiled and said it wasn't him doing it. She looked confused and asked who was, but Ricky didn't explain. He leaned in and kissed her instead, as if that answered everything. Back at church, James stood before the small crowd that had shown up. The pews were mostly empty, and he could feel the weight of it. But he didn't hide from it. He told them why people weren't there, because Ricky was playing a game that could change his life. A game that might lead him to the major leagues. James admitted something he'd never said out loud before, that he'd never once gone to one of Ricky's games. Not until tonight. At the stadium, the lights shone down hard on the field. Ricky stepped up to the plate in front of thousands. There were cheers from every direction. In the crowd, even his old youth coach, Don, was there, clapping and shouting his name. Then came Jake, a four-time college American player, one of the best. He stepped onto the pitcher's mound and took his stance. The first throw flew, but Jake barely made contact. The crowd went quiet. On the next pitch, Ricky narrowed his focus. Jake sent the ball fast and high, but Ricky swung with everything he had. This time he connected. The crack of the bat echoed across the stadium. The ball flew high and far, and the crowd erupted into cheers. Meanwhile, back in the church, James spoke again. His voice was low but steady. He told the congregation he finally saw it. How wrong he had been. He said he'd clung so tightly to what he thought God's plan was for Ricky that he'd stopped listening. Tears welled in his eyes as he told them he'd been selfish, that he wasn't leading them the way he was supposed to, not with wisdom or compassion, but with pride and fear. And now, all he could do was ask for their forgiveness. Back on the field, Red signaled for a new pitcher. The crowd stirred with anticipation. As a new pitcher warmed up, Ricky stood at the plate, calm but focused. The first pitch came fast. Ricky swung and sent the ball flying straight down the center. Red had to take a step back to avoid being hit. Another pitcher came in. Same result. Then another. Again, Ricky connected cleanly. One by one, 10 different pitchers stepped onto the mound, and Ricky sent every pitch sailing. 10 pitches. 10 clean hits. Red had seen plenty of talent over the years, but something about this made him stop and pay closer attention. With the crowd buzzing, Red finally nodded to someone in the dugout. Jimmy stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered. He had a hard glare as he walked onto the mound. It was clear he wasn't there to play nice. His first throw was blistering. Ricky barely saw it pass. The second zipped by again. He couldn't even move his bat. The third was a foul. Ricky clipped it off balance. Then came a fourth pitch. I didn't miss it. The ball slammed hard into Ricky's side, and he dropped to the ground, clutching his ribs. The crowd gasped. Ricky was in pain, clearly struggling to breathe. Red walked over and knelt beside him. He told him that there was no need to continue. He'd already proven everything he needed. 10 out of 10. That was more than enough. But Ricky shook his head. He didn't want to end it there. One last pitch. The crowd went silent. Everyone watched. Just then, James appeared. He had finally made it. He stood quietly near the edge of the field, his eyes fixed on his son. Jimmy wound up. The ball flew. Ricky swung. It was perfect. The ball soared high, way past the outfield wall, clearing the far fence and disappearing from sight. The stadium erupted in cheers. Ricky took off down the field, holding his side as he ran. As he rounded second, he spotted James in the stands. They locked eyes. Ricky slowed just for a second. Neither of them said a word, but both were fighting back tears. Ricky crossed home plate, and his teammates lifted him into the air. The crowd chanted his name. Red stood quietly off to the side, watching with an unreadable expression. Then, satisfied, he turned and walked away. After the game, James finally embraced his son. He smiled and said, "You better get used to this." On June 1st, 1975, Ricky signed with the Montreal Expos. He married Gracie right there on home plate. James was the one who officiated the ceremony. For 4 years, Ricky played in the Expos farm system. Then in 1979, his spine gave out. He never played professional baseball again. Today, Ricky coaches Little League and teaches golf in Fort Worth, Texas.